What if I told you the reason you feel stuck isn't because life is unfair or because you lack motivation, but because you've made peace with your own weakness? Be honest. How many times have you known exactly what you needed to do and still chose distraction over discipline? How often do you tell yourself you're tired, burnt out, overworked, when deep down you know you're just avoiding the friction that transformation demands? The truth is brutal. The life you're living right now is the exact result of everything you've allowed. And the version of you that craves comfort, that delays, that negotiates, it's not your ally, it's your captor. The Stoics didn't see discipline as a tool for success. They saw it as the foundation of freedom, because until you command yourself, you are a slave to your impulses. This video isn't here to inspire you. It's here to confront you with the version of yourself that needs to die so the real one can emerge. If you're ready to stop reacting and start reigning, if you believe growth begins where comfort ends, then consider subscribing to follow through on becoming who you were always meant to be. It's never loud. It never announces itself with alarms or warnings. The weaker version of you, what some might call the comfort self, whispers. It moves in the quiet moments, not the loud ones. When your eyes open in the morning and you feel that resistance to rising, that's not tiredness. That's it speaking. When you know there's work to do, but your hand reaches for your phone anyway, that's it reaching through you. And when you convince yourself that you deserve a break, that you've done enough for today, even when deep down you know you've barely touched your potential. That voice in your head that sounds so reasonable, so calm, so convincing, that is not your ally. That is your captor. It doesn't scream because it doesn't have to. It's learned your language. It knows how to dress itself up as rest, as balance, as care. But it's none of those things. It is resistance in disguise. It's not asking you to stop. It's just asking you to wait, just a little longer. But that wait turns into days, days into weeks, and weeks into years. That weak self is cunning. It doesn't fight for dominance. It waits for you to surrender. It doesn't push. It nudges. And all it needs is for you to hesitate. That's how it grows. It thrives in the pause before you act, in the breath before you commit. It tells you stories that feel true. You've been through a lot. You should rest. You'll be more focused tomorrow. It's okay to slow down. But every time you say yes to those soft lies, you build a life out of compromise. Comfort is not the reward. It's the trap. The weak self convinces you to accept ease now at the cost of strength later. And the trade always looks harmless until you look back and see the pattern. The abandoned goals, the fading discipline, the emptiness behind the excuses. You see, the weak self doesn't demand control. It survives off what you allow. It doesn't win by overpowering you. It wins because you stop showing up. It grows in your absence. It multiplies in your silence. And it tells you it's doing you a favor, that it's protecting you from burnout, from stress, from failure. But in truth, it's protecting you from growth, because growth requires confrontation. It requires discomfort, friction, movement, and the weak self wants none of that. It would rather you stay where you are, familiar, safe, stagnant. So it doesn't fight you directly. It just gently steers you toward inaction, and you barely notice until your fire has dimmed and your edge has dulled. There's a reason why the Stoics didn't speak of comfort as a virtue. They spoke of endurance, of command, of rising with the weight still on your shoulders. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength doesn't arrive by chance. It arrives when you stop obeying the whisper, when you recognize that voice for what it is, the quiet sound of self-betrayal. It's not screaming at you because it doesn't need to. It already lives in your habits, in your impulses, in your rationalizations. But once you see it, truly see it, you can begin to separate who you are from what you've been tolerating. The dangerous part is how familiar that voice becomes. Because it mirrors you, it becomes easy to mistake its comfort for truth. You begin to believe that discipline is extreme, that consistency is rigidity, that ambition is arrogance. The weak self paints effort as obsession, drive as delusion, and over time, if you're not careful, you'll lower your standards just to silence the conflict within you. But lowering your standard doesn't remove the conflict. It only deepens the regret. It's in these moments, when you feel that tug toward ease, that craving for delay, that you must remember, permission doesn't have to be loud to be lethal. You don't need a catastrophic failure to derail your path. You only need the repeated decision to settle. Settling is slow erosion. It doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like relief. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because if pain was the cost of weakness, you'd resist it. But when comfort is the cost, you don't notice what it's taking from you until it's gone. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's the trap. You'll think life is happening to you when really you've just surrendered the wheel to a version of yourself that never wanted to move forward in the first place. The weak self doesn't need to overpower your will. It just needs to guide it into sleep. And if you let it, you'll build a life that looks peaceful on the outside, but burns with quiet dissatisfaction underneath. That's not peace. That's sedation. So if you're tired of the cycle, if you're done waking up and feeling like time is slipping through your hands, if you're ready to stop negotiating with your weakness, then you need to start recognizing it. Not with hatred, but with precision. See it clearly, hear its tone, watch when it shows up, and then act anyway. Move before it persuades you. Choose order before it can offer escape. Let the day begin before your emotions vote. Let your actions speak before your thoughts get a chance to soften them. This isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming aware. The weak self thrives in blindness, but once you start seeing it, once you stop mistaking its kindness for truth, you begin to replace obedience with command. And that's the beginning of change. Not flashy, not loud, just a quiet refusal to keep saying yes to the wrong version of you. Balance is seductive. It arrives wearing the face of wisdom, whispering soft reassurances that you can have it all, ambition without exhaustion, growth without discomfort, progress without pressure. It tells you to work hard, but only when it feels right. To strive, but never too far outside your comfort zone. It offers a version of effort that's palatable, manageable, easy to recover from. And that's exactly how it traps you. Because real transformation doesn't come from what's manageable. It comes from what's necessary. And often, what's necessary feels extreme, until the results arrive and prove it was simply required. Moderation sounds noble. Who doesn't want a life that's balanced, steady, in control? But the danger comes when balance becomes the excuse for avoidance. When "I don't want to burn out" is really code for "I don't want to face the burn that change demands." The weak self knows this, so it doesn't fight your desire to grow. It just limits the terms. It lets you move forward, but slowly, cautiously, quietly. It offers you just enough momentum to avoid guilt, but never enough to create momentum. That's the lie. That you're doing something meaningful when in truth you're circling the same plateau. Stillness wrapped in the language of self-care is one of the most dangerous forms of stagnation. It feels responsible. It feels smart. But if you look at your own life, if you take inventory of your behavior, you might find that what you've called balance has actually become a cage. You start protecting your time, your peace, your energy so much that you never stretch, you never strain, you never struggle. And if you never struggle, you never grow. The life you want isn't hidden behind more comfort. It's buried under the sacrifices you've been taught to avoid. There's a quiet cruelty in the middle path when it's taken out of fear, because it asks for none of your fire, none of your edge, none of your power. It asks you to dial everything down, to be reasonable. And when you follow that advice, you wake up one day and realize you've lost the intensity that once made you feel alive. Balance without challenge is just passive existence. It's drifting. It's a slow surrender of your potential to routines that never demand anything new from you. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege doesn't come wrapped in moderation. It's earned through tension, through inner conflict, through standing at the edge of what you think you can handle and deciding to push anyway. Who you truly are isn't found in moments of calm. It's revealed when you choose pressure on purpose. The idea that you can become your best self without disrupting your current self is fantasy. The current self must be disturbed, shaken, questioned, broken. And that doesn't happen in balance. It happens in confrontation. The weak self will call this thinking dangerous. It'll say, "You'll burn out, you'll fall apart, you'll lose yourself." But ask yourself, what if you've already been losing yourself in safety? What if the identity you're protecting is the very one keeping you small? That voice pretending to care about your well-being may actually be the reason you never step into your real power. Because power requires weight. It requires responsibility. It demands presence, not excuses. Balance that protects your peace but costs you your purpose is not balance. It's surrender. And the more you rationalize your limits, the more you start mistaking absence of chaos for progress. But stillness is not always peace. Sometimes stillness is simply avoidance. You weren't built to live in the middle. You were built to rise. And that means walking into discomfort willingly, letting it refine you, letting it teach you what comfort never could. Epictetus once said, "No great thing is created suddenly, and yet we keep hoping for greatness without effort, without extremes, without that moment where you break routine and become unrecognizable to your former self." Balance wants to preserve you. Discipline wants to evolve you. And evolution always requires disruption. It's not reckless. It's necessary. Growth doesn't ask for permission. It demands commitment. And commitment isn't built in moderation. It's forged in the refusal to be half present in your own life. It's easy to admire balance from a distance. It looks serene, but inside it often hides a quiet desperation, a longing for something more, something bolder, something real. You feel it when you lie awake at night and realize you didn't stretch yourself today. You feel it when you see someone move with purpose and you remember what it's like to want something that deeply, that ache. That's the part of you that knows balance has become a mask, and underneath it, you're still waiting for the moment you finally commit. Seneca once wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." The fear of losing balance has become the excuse to never dare. But balance is not the goal. Alignment is. Alignment with your purpose, your principles, your potential. And alignment isn't peaceful. It's demanding. But unlike balance, it delivers. It takes you somewhere. It makes you better. It reshapes you. If you want the life balance promises, you must be willing to outgrow it. To step into a season that feels heavier, sharper, less forgiving, but infinitely more alive. Because real peace isn't found in protecting your boundaries, it's found in expanding them, not recklessly, but intentionally, choosing discomfort that has direction over comfort that leads nowhere. The weak self wants you to chase calm, but the strong self, it wants you to chase clarity. And clarity often comes from movement, from pressure, from stepping so far outside your usual rhythm that something inside you shifts. That's where real transformation begins. Not in staying safe, but in choosing purpose over preservation. Aristotle believed that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit, and habits don't form in ease. They form in intensity, in discomfort, in the tension between who you've been and who you're becoming. That's where identity is reshaped, not gradually, but with weight, with fire, with focus. Balance is a beginning, not a destination. And if you stay there too long, you forget what it feels like to be alive inside your own pursuit. You don't need balance right now. You need momentum. You need days where you push yourself so fully that the weak self doesn't even get a chance to speak. You need effort that doesn't need to be justified. Movement that doesn't ask for applause. You need to walk into the storm of your own excuses and realize it was never about working harder. It was about working honestly. And honesty doesn't always feel balanced, but it always builds something real. No one wakes up with discipline wired into their bones. You were not born with structure or self-mastery. You were born impulsive, emotional, raw, wired to react to whatever the moment demands. That's the default setting. But default is not destiny. Discipline is not inherited. It's assembled, one difficult decision at a time. One choice to show up when you'd rather delay. One refusal to let emotions steer the wheel. Every time you do what's hard without waiting for the perfect mindset, you're not just making progress, you're building something internal, something permanent. The person you admire, the one who moves with command and clarity, they didn't find that in themselves. They forged it. And you're not any different. The version of you you're chasing won't be discovered. It must be constructed, slowly, deliberately, brick by brick. Each time you resist the easy path, even in the smallest ways, you're laying the groundwork for identity. Not the one handed to you by circumstance, the one shaped by intention. The weak version of you is born in reaction. It lives in your unguarded moments, thrives on impulse, feeds on delay. It doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs repetition. The strong version, that one doesn't happen by accident. It's deliberate. It emerges only when you stop being who you've always been and start becoming who you're meant to be. That kind of becoming requires friction, and friction feels uncomfortable. But if you avoid it, you avoid yourself. But identity isn't just built by what you do. It's shaped even more by what you stop tolerating. You cannot grow into a disciplined person while still clinging to the behaviors that built your weakness. You can't build a structure while protecting the debris of the old one. You have to clear it. That means you must confront it, your habits, your language, your mindset. That means holding your excuses up to the light and seeing them for what they are. The old self trying to survive through logic. Discipline isn't the act of doing more, it's the act of becoming less reactive to your inner noise. Most people never become who they're meant to be because they keep trying to improve the version they should have already buried. They decorate it, justify it, make it slightly more productive, but they never replace it. And that's why they always feel stuck. You can't become disciplined while still identifying with the undisciplined version of yourself. At some point you have to draw a line and say, that is no longer me. Not just in words, but in behavior, consistently, repeatedly, without applause. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." That's the shift. Identity doesn't form through reflection alone. It forms when reflection turns into action, when the principles you believe become the patterns you live. Most of us know what we should be doing, but until you begin doing it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard, you remain the same. Thought alone doesn't change identity. Conduct does. And here's the hardest part. Discipline feels fake before it feels natural. The first time you act with intention, it feels forced. The second time, it feels heavy. The 10th time, it still feels strange. But eventually, the body starts to obey. The mind starts to accept. And slowly, without any grand announcement, it starts to feel like you. That's not imposter syndrome. That's what growth feels like. It feels unfamiliar at first because you've never been this version of you before. Identity construction is never instant. It's not one breakthrough. It's not one big decision. It's not some dramatic turning point. It's the small, unglamorous choices made when no one's watching. It's choosing to rise when your old self says, rest. Choosing to speak truth when your old self says, avoid. Choosing to train when your old self says, skip. You become who you are by what you repeatedly do when it's inconvenient. Not once, always. Seneca once warned, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And that's what keeps the old self alive. Imagination. The fear of how hard it might be. The stories you tell yourself about why you can't change yet. The belief that you're not ready, not capable, not built like that. But the only reason you're not built like that is because you haven't built it yet. And the only way to build it is to stop retreating into thought and start investing in action. Discipline isn't about self-punishment, it's about self-respect. It's not about being rigid, it's about being deliberate. It's not about doing everything, it's about doing the right things consistently. The new identity you want isn't hidden, it's simply waiting on the other side of your resistance. The question isn't whether you're capable of becoming that person. The question is whether you're willing to keep showing up until the old version no longer fits. Every disciplined act is a vote against who you were, a vote for who you're becoming. And the only way to win that election is to keep voting daily, without fanfare, without waiting to feel like it. Identity doesn't respond to moods, it responds to action. And when action becomes your default, the question of who you are answers itself, not with words, but with evidence, not with hope, but with proof. The strong self doesn't arrive fully formed. It's built through days of silence, weeks of resistance, and years of deliberate repetition, through thousands of choices that no one will ever see. And if you can carry that weight long enough, something inside you will shift. And the weak self, the reactive one, the one built on excuses, won't even recognize the person you've become. Because it's not a version of you anymore, it's just a memory of what you once settled for. Comfort feels kind, but it's deceptive. It arrives dressed as relief, disguised as care, but what it truly does is slowly convince you that stillness is the goal. You reach for it in moments of stress, tell yourself you've earned it, and then wrap yourself in it like a blanket. But you don't rise from it refreshed. You sink deeper. The break becomes longer than planned. The pause turns into avoidance. And before you realize it, the moment of peace you were chasing becomes a pattern of escape. That's the trap. You don't notice it happening because comfort doesn't shout. It seduces. It soothes you into settling, and still, you convince yourself it's healing. That maybe if you rest a little longer, things will make more sense. That maybe the clarity you're looking for will arrive once you've recharged. But time inside a cage doesn't set you free, it just dulls your ambition until the walls feel like safety. Every time you retreat into comfort without purpose, you give away a piece of your edge, and it doesn't come back quickly. The mind remembers ease, it craves it, and the more often you let it win, the more foreign challenge begins to feel. What once was normal effort now feels impossible, and slowly, without realizing, you lose your ability to face resistance without flinching. There is no victory in what feels easy. There is no transformation in what asks nothing of you. Growth requires pressure. It requires a kind of discomfort that doesn't break you, but reveals you. And the problem with comfort is that it's just pleasurable enough to keep you from seeking something greater. That's what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't feel destructive. It feels deserved. But what it really does is freeze you in place while time moves forward without your permission. Carl Jung once observed, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And this is what comfort protects you from: the mirror. It protects you from seeing how far you've drifted from the person you're meant to be. It cushions your decline with distractions and justifications. It keeps you preoccupied with numbing instead of reflecting. That's why comfort is never just rest. It's often denial with softer lighting. And when you sit in it too long, it stops being a choice. It becomes your character. The cage you've built isn't made of metal or brick. It's made of habits, of skipped mornings, of conversations avoided, of small decisions that added up. And because the bars are invisible, you stop believing they're there. You just think you've lost motivation. But you haven't lost it. You've drowned it. In convenience, in scrolling, in the need to feel okay before you act. You've been waiting to feel good enough to do what needs to be done, and that wait has turned into delay, and the delay into decay. You weren't designed to live in avoidance. You were built to confront. That's why deep down, you feel the quiet ache every time you let another day pass untouched by effort. That guilt isn't something to run from. It's proof that something in you still remembers who you are. The part of you that craves more is not asking for peace. It's asking for purpose. And purpose never lives in comfort. It lives in clarity. And clarity is earned through confrontation, not retreat. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." That's what comfort does. It convinces you to crave less, to desire nothing, to trade hunger for satisfaction. And once you no longer desire challenge, you stop growing. You stop moving. The fire in you dims. And what you're left with is a version of yourself that is no longer dangerous to its own limitations. That's not peace. That's paralysis. The life you want isn't waiting at the edge of comfort. It's buried underneath all the reasons you've convinced yourself that now is not the time. Comfort will always offer you an out. It'll always remind you that tomorrow is available, but tomorrow doesn't exist in your hands. Only this moment does. And if you don't claim it, the weak self will. That version of you that wants nothing but ease and reassurance, it is always waiting to return. And all it needs is your permission. You can feel the difference, can't you? Between the days you chose structure and the days you surrendered to softness. One leaves you heavier, one leaves you clear. You don't need more balance, you need more truth. And the truth is, the most meaningful parts of your life, the parts that made you feel proud, focused, alive, never came from sitting still. They came from movement, from effort, from leaning into the pressure you were told to avoid. Epictetus once said, "Difficulties show what men are, not ideas, not intentions, not potential. Difficulties. The pressure you resist is the exact pressure that reveals you. But when you run from it, you never get to meet yourself. Not the real you, just the version that settles. And that version will always take the easy road. Always prioritize comfort over command. Always choose delay over decision. And as long as you follow it, you remain in the cage. But the moment you start doing what needs to be done before you feel ready, something shifts. The comfort you once clung to starts to feel heavy, not healing, not helpful, just hollow, and the cage begins to crack. Because comfort can't survive where discipline lives, it can't breathe where structure rules, and the more you move under your own command, the less you'll tolerate the cushions that used to trap you. The cage is not built in one day, and it's not destroyed in one day either, but every action you take toward discipline, every moment you override the impulse to delay, is a fracture in its foundation, and one day, without announcement, you'll realize you no longer reach for the things that used to numb you. You no longer feel safe in comfort. You feel ready in clarity. And from that place, you don't need to escape anymore. You've outgrown the walls. You've reclaimed your command. Aristotle said, "We become what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The same is true for weakness. You become what you tolerate. And if you keep choosing comfort, you become it. But if you start choosing resistance, not recklessly, but intentionally, you start becoming someone who no longer fears pressure, but uses it. Someone who doesn't wait for discipline, but acts as it. That's the shift. That's the quiet exit from the cage, not with noise, not with rage, but with the repeated decision to move through resistance instead of around it. The comfort you crave doesn't free you. It only makes the cage more pleasant. And you weren't made to be pleasant. You were made to move, to build, to become. So stop fluffing the pillows, start breaking the walls, and don't stop until comfort feels like confinement, and effort feels like home. You probably imagine change like a thunderstorm, loud, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. A singular defining moment where everything shifts and suddenly you're someone new. But real transformation doesn't sound like a war cry. It sounds like silence. It looks like you, alone, staring at the task you swore you'd do, and feeling the weight of deciding whether today is the day you finally follow through. There's no applause in that moment, no spotlight, just you, and the voice in your head, and the gravity of your own promise. The true war isn't waged in one epic battle. It's fought in 1,000 small ones. When it's early and cold, and your bed is warm, when no one will know if you skip this one time, when the only reward is integrity, and the only witness is your conscience. The weaker version of you is clever. It doesn't try to overpower you with resistance. It doesn't need to. It just needs you to pause, to hesitate, to consider the option of later. And it's convincing. It tells you you've done enough for today, that you've earned some rest, that maybe tomorrow you'll have more clarity, more energy, more willpower, but tomorrow is always a promise, never a plan. And that voice, the one that sounds so reasonable, isn't offering rest. It's offering retreat. The weak self doesn't want you to quit. It just wants you to delay, because delay is slow defeat. The hard part isn't knowing what you need to do. You already know. It's in your plan, your journal, your goals. The hard part is holding the line when no one is watching, when doing the right thing won't get you recognition or praise, just personal alignment. That's where most people break. Not publicly, but privately. Not because they were weak, but because they expected the war to be louder. They thought it would feel like a movie scene. But growth isn't cinematic. It's repetitive. It's invisible. And if you're waiting for it to feel powerful before you act, you'll miss the moment every single day. There's no trophy for doing what you said you'd do. No one is going to thank you for waking up on time, for putting in effort, for showing restraint when you could have indulged. And that's what makes the war so difficult. The enemy doesn't come from outside. It doesn't wear armor or carry a weapon. It wears your face. It uses your voice. And it speaks in a tone that sounds like logic, but is really just fear in disguise. Its goal isn't to destroy you, it's to distract you just long enough for the fire to fade. Seneca warned, "While we waste our time hesitating and postponing, life is slipping away." And that's the quiet tragedy of the war not being loud. You don't hear the moment you lose, you just drift, a little each day, until what was once urgency becomes indifference, until the version of you that used to reach has settled for surviving. But survival is not the goal, not if something inside you still longs to rise. This war is fought in choices, not grand ones, but subtle ones. It happens when you reach for your phone instead of your goals, when you scroll instead of reflect, when you promise to begin tomorrow instead of just starting. And each time you give in, the old self strengthens its grip. It grows not because it's stronger than you, but because it's been fed more often. The more you listen to it, the more familiar it feels. But familiarity is not truth, and ease is not alignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." That kind of clarity doesn't come from volume. It comes from discipline, from knowing what matters even when nothing outside you reminds you of it. The war being quiet doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means you need to raise your awareness to hear it, to recognize when the weak self enters the room and speaks like a friend, and to answer with action, not argument. The mistake is thinking discipline requires motivation. It doesn't. Discipline is what begins when motivation ends, when the mood is gone and the reasons are weak, and the only thing left is your decision to stand your ground. That's where transformation lives. Not in the dramatic days, but in the forgettable ones, the ones that don't feel special, the ones that pass without notice. But over time, those unnoticed victories become the foundation of everything you're becoming. This isn't about being perfect, it's about being present, knowing that your enemy won't always look like resistance. It'll often look like rest, like balance, like compassion. And that's when you need to be ruthless. Not with yourself, but with the part of you that wants you small, that wants you soft, that wants you the same. That version has no power unless you feed it. And the moment you stop listening, even once, you've already taken ground back. Aristotle once said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And habits are formed in silence. Repetition becomes rhythm. Rhythm becomes identity. The war isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It already knows your patterns, but now you know its patterns too. And that's where the shift begins. When you stop needing the fire to feel big and start trusting the quiet to shape you. The next time you face that moment, that choice between ease and effort, between silence and strength, remember, this is the war. It's not flashy, it's not loud, it's not public, but it's real, and you win it by doing what needs to be done, without explanation, without delay, and without needing the world to notice. You'll know, and that's enough. We grow up believing that readiness is a signal, that one day we'll wake up feeling aligned, confident, clear, that the doubt will be gone, the path will be lit, and everything inside us will point to now. But that day rarely comes, because readiness isn't a signal. It's a story, a comforting, well-rehearsed lie we tell ourselves to avoid the discomfort of starting. You wait for the moment to feel right before you move, but the truth is, it's never going to feel perfect. Not at the beginning, and that doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It means you're human. The illusion of readiness is the oldest trick in the book, and most people will spend their entire lives waiting to feel ready, never realizing that action was the thing that would have created that feeling in the first place. The world doesn't reward potential. It rewards action. You don't get credit for who you could be, only for what you consistently become. And that process begins in defiance, not inspiration. You don't wait for belief to land in your lap. You move, even with doubt in your chest, even with resistance in your body. You take the step before you feel stable. You show up before the confidence arrives. And something strange begins to happen. Your movement builds the mindset you were waiting for. Your action creates the clarity you thought you needed before starting. You've been told it works the other way around. That belief comes first. But belief is often born from evidence. And the only way to generate that evidence is to do the work. The people who cross over into transformation aren't the ones who feel most ready. They're the ones who feel the fear, the fog, the hesitation, and act anyway, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with discipline, with conviction, with the understanding that perfection isn't a requirement for progress. In fact, it's often the barrier. The weaker version of you thrives on delay. It doesn't scream, "Quit." It softly whispers, "Not yet." Let's wait until we're more prepared. Let's get a little more information. Let's rest first, then begin tomorrow. But what that version of you doesn't tell you is that tomorrow brings the same doubts, the same hesitation. And before long, tomorrow becomes next month. Next month becomes next year. And eventually, you're not waiting anymore. You're stuck. Stuck in a cycle of planning, preparing, researching, everything but starting, because you believed the lie that readiness would knock. And one of the most common ways we waste it is by mistaking mental rehearsal for movement. You can visualize, journal, affirm all you want, but none of it replaces the power of stepping into discomfort, of doing the thing unprepared. Not because you're careless, but because you've realized preparation has become your excuse. Some of your most important decisions will come before you feel emotionally ready to make them. And that's okay, because emotional alignment often lags behind decisive action. You don't need more time, you need more truth. And the truth is, no moment will ever feel perfect enough. Readiness is a moving target. Every time you get closer to it, it shifts. That's because your standards grow with your delay. The more time you give yourself to prepare, the more pressure you place on the start. And eventually the start feels so heavy that it collapses under its own weight. That's how resistance wins. Not by stopping you, but by convincing you to perfect your approach until it's too big to begin. The disciplined mind doesn't chase readiness. It builds momentum through rhythm, not motivation. It understands that consistency doesn't begin with energy. It begins with commitment. And commitment doesn't care about your mood. It only asks whether you're still moving when the feelings fade. Because they will. And when they do, your only hope is structure. Not inspiration, not emotion, just action backed by a decision you've already made. Epictetus taught, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. That's the difference. The undisciplined self waits to feel capable. The disciplined one moves as if it already is, not from arrogance, but from alignment, from understanding that action doesn't follow belief, it forges it. You become disciplined by acting disciplined. You become consistent by being consistent. Identity doesn't wait for readiness. It forms from repetition, from refusing to let the weather inside you dictate the work in front of you. And that refusal doesn't feel glamorous. It feels quiet, awkward, uncomfortable. But inside that discomfort is your edge, your real edge. Not the one you show the world, but the one that appears when you're alone, uncertain, and still choose to move forward. That's how strength is built. Not in ideal conditions, but in inconvenient ones. Not when you feel bold, but when you feel broken and still show up anyway. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." And to truly know yourself You have to move beyond theory. You have to test your limits. You have to stretch beyond your current patterns. And that means starting before you're confident. Not because you want to, but because you refuse to keep lying to yourself about needing more time. That's not truth. That's fear wearing strategy as a mask. The longer you wait, the louder the doubts become. The heavier the first step feels. But once you take it, once you step into motion, the fog begins to lift. It won't disappear all at once, but it will thin. And with each move you'll see more. Understand more, trust yourself more. Not because you figured it all out, but because you didn't wait to figure it all out before acting. Readiness is not a requirement, it's a result. And the sooner you let go of needing to feel ready, the sooner you'll become someone who acts from principle instead of permission. The weak self will always beg for more time. The strong self doesn't ask. It moves, quietly, daily, without debate. And the more you do that, the more you'll realize what you were waiting for wasn't readiness. It was courage. And courage doesn't wait. It leads. Pain doesn't show up by accident. It arrives at the very moment you start pressing against your limits, and not the limits the world gave you, the limits you built for yourself. The soft walls of habit, the quiet ceilings of doubt, the invisible fences of fear. You touch them and it stings, not because you're broken, but because something inside you knows it can't stay the same. Pain isn't just discomfort. It's a confrontation, a sign that you're standing at the edge of who you were, and something deeper is being asked of you. Most people mistake that signal as a reason to stop, to retreat, to protect what feels familiar. But the truth is, that pain isn't a warning. It's proof that you're in the right place. It's easy to forget that growth and safety rarely exist in the same space. The very things that stretch us are the ones that threaten the weaker parts of us, the parts that make excuses, that delay, that fold the moment discomfort knocks. Those parts aren't evil. They were built to protect you from risk, from exposure. But they don't understand the cost. Because every time you obey those parts, every time you let them convince you to step back, you pay with your potential. You pay with the version of you that could have been, the one hiding just on the other side of the struggle you keep avoiding. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And that line speaks to more than just philosophy. It speaks to the process, the real process, the internal transformation that doesn't happen with ease but with intensity. Because the person you want to become doesn't live in the same patterns as the person you've been. Something has to break, something has to burn, and pain is the flame that starts the change. But it's not just the sharp pain of failure. It's the slow, grinding kind too. The ache of waking up early when you want to sleep. The mental resistance that hits when you're about to do something hard. The emotional weight of doubt as you move towards something bigger than what you think you're ready for. That's where the real war is. In the invisible moments when no one is watching. In the choice between ease and effort. Between comfort and character. Seneca reminded us, difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body. He didn't say they entertain the mind, or that they give you peace. He said they strengthen it, which means your most painful moments are often your most productive, even if they don't feel like it at the time. Because pain, when faced with intention, is a teacher. It shows you where your boundaries are, and more importantly, it dares you to cross them. But this isn't about glorifying suffering. It's about respecting the signal, understanding that pain isn't the enemy. It's the invitation to stay in it just a little longer, to breathe through the urge to quit, to prove to yourself that you're not controlled by old wiring. Every time you push through the friction, you are slowly burying the version of you that always needed things to be easy. And you're pulling a new self forward, one built in pressure, in purpose, in choice. That's why the moment you want to stop is the exact moment that matters most, because that's when your body says, enough, but your mind gets to reply, not yet. That's when your comfort zone puts up its last fight, and you get to decide whether it wins. Most people wait for motivation to push them, but motivation is fleeting. What actually transforms you is momentum, choosing to keep going when there's no feeling left to support it. When the only thing you have is the decision not to quit. There is no victory without a fight, no transformation without tension, and no breakthrough without resistance. Pain is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. It's the pressure that refines, the resistance that forges. It's the fire that forces the weak parts of you to either evolve or get left behind. And the deeper you walk into it, the more you start to see that pain doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're finally doing it real. And maybe that's the mindset shift. You stop asking, how do I avoid pain? And you start asking, what kind of pain is worth enduring? Because either way, you suffer. You suffer from regret, or you suffer from discipline. You suffer from the weight of inaction or from the tension of growth. But only one of those leads somewhere. Only one of those makes you proud of who you've become on the other side. Pain sharpens you. It calls your bluff. It tests whether the words you say about who you want to be actually mean anything. And when you lean into it, not to punish yourself but to refine yourself, you start to change your relationship with it. You stop fearing it and start using it. Not to break you, but to build you. Marcus Aurelius once noted, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And that's the core truth. The very thing you think is blocking your progress might be the very thing that is your progress. That pain, that resistance, that urge to quit, it's not the enemy, it's the gate. And on the other side is the person you were meant to become. You just have to prove you're willing to walk through it. Most people think rebellion looks like noise, loud moves, bold statements, grand gestures that demand to be seen. But real rebellion, the kind that changes you from the inside out, is silent. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg for permission. It happens in the small moments, the ones no one claps for, when you get up without being told, when you show up without being praised, when you do what needs to be done, not because you feel like it, but because you promised yourself you would. That's discipline, and that's the quiet rebellion against everything that once held you back. You don't have to explain your choices to anyone, not your distance, not your focus, not your silence. When discipline becomes your language, your energy starts to shift. You stop needing external validation to move forward. You stop waiting for the world to approve what you already know is necessary. The weak version of you needs applause. The strong version moves without it, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Because once you realize what's at stake, once you truly grasp what's lost when you give in to comfort, you can't go back to the old patterns. You won't. And that's the beauty of self-respect. It doesn't scream, it doesn't parade, it simply acts. It becomes the force behind the alarm you don't snooze, the meal you don't skip, the workout you don't negotiate. It's the force that refuses to make excuses. Because when you've tasted the strength of consistency, inconsistency starts to taste like betrayal. And not betrayal of others, betrayal of yourself, of the future you swore you'd build, of the standard you said you'd hold. You'll notice something shift when discipline starts to take over. You'll stop needing motivation to get moving. You'll stop negotiating with laziness. You'll stop hoping for better days and start creating them. You won't need to say, "I'm trying," you'll simply be doing. And that's the moment your life changes, not when you talk about it, but when your actions start saying everything your words used to. Seneca once wrote, Throw me to the wolves and I will return leading the pack. That's not bravado. That's the confidence that comes from discipline. Because when your routine is forged in silence and pressure, there's nothing left to prove. You've already faced the hardest part of the battle, the temptation to quit. And every time you resisted, you added another layer to the armor of who you are. You don't need to share your journey for it to matter. You don't need to track your growth for it to be real. If you're waking up earlier, moving with purpose, resisting the pull of mediocrity, then you're already winning. Because the strongest kind of discipline doesn't announce itself. It whispers, keep going, even when your body aches and your mind screams to stop. Let the world chase dopamine. Let them post their highlights, search for shortcuts, and drown in validation. You rise in silence. You honor the contract you signed with yourself. Not the one written on paper, but the one carved into your character. That says, I will not betray who I'm becoming just to please who I used to be. There's a kind of peace that comes when you know you're no longer available for your old excuses. When you stop entertaining the voice that says, just this once. When you stop reasoning with your weaker self and start replacing hesitation with action. And it won't always feel heroic. It won't always feel rewarding in the moment. But the mirror sees it. The silence records it. Your future self remembers it. And it adds up. Every rep, every early morning, every task done without applause. It's all stacking, all compounding, all building the kind of life most people say they want, but aren't willing to earn. Because discipline doesn't offer instant rewards. It offers identity. It turns you into someone whose habits match their vision. Someone whose life reflects what they said they wanted. Not just once, but every single day. You don't need to wait for inspiration. That's the old way. That's the path of those who start strong and fade fast. The truth is, inspiration is a byproduct of action, not the cause of it. You move first. You push first. You decide now. And eventually, the feelings catch up. But even if they don't, it doesn't matter. Because you didn't build this life on emotion. You built it on discipline. And that's the quiet rebellion. The refusal to live like everyone else, to wait for the perfect time, to need to be seen before moving. You move because you said you would. You act because the alternative is being someone you swore you'd never be again. That's the core of this path. Not loud, not flashy, just true, just strong, just real. Excuses are clever. They don't shout, they whisper, they sound like logic. They speak in the language of just this once, or I'll start tomorrow. And over time, they become comforting, familiar, even protective. But comfort isn't the same as truth. And in the silence between who you are and who you could be, excuses are the only thing keeping you stuck. The weak self depends on them like oxygen, not because they're valid, but because they're easy to say, easy to believe, easy to hide behind when you don't want to face the discomfort of effort. But there's no version of your future that respects your excuses. There's no version of your strongest self that's built on delay. 2026 has no memory of 2025. It doesn't remember who betrayed you, who failed you, or who walked away. It doesn't care about the setbacks that slowed you down or the chaos that drained you. All it cares about is what you do now, right now. Because the truth is, your excuses may explain your past, but they cannot justify your future. If you want change, you don't need a better plan. You need a better response when your feelings say not today. Because real change doesn't happen when it feels right. It happens when you act despite how wrong it feels. You don't overcome weakness by negotiating with it. You don't talk it out of its patterns. You starve it, you remove its fuel. And that fuel is delay, that pause between your intention and your action. That's where your excuses live. They grow in the seconds you hesitate. They become stronger every time you say, I'll wait until I feel better. But waiting to feel better is like waiting for the rain to stop before learning how to swim. Life isn't going to pause for you to catch up. It's going to keep going, and it's going to reward the ones who move forward, even when they don't feel ready. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." You can't rewrite your past, but you can refuse to let it write your next chapter. And that refusal begins with a decision to kill the story you've been telling yourself, the one where you need more time, the one where you're not ready, the one where tomorrow is always the answer. Excuses are nothing but lies told with emotion. They feel real, but they are not. And every time you act without them, you become more powerful than the version of you who believed them. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes when you no longer need to defend your inaction, when you stop needing to explain your stagnation, when you finally admit, "I've been holding myself back," not because you're broken, not because you're lazy, but because the weak self is seductive. It offers relief without progress, distraction without growth. It tells you what you want to hear and robs you of what you truly want to become. But when you stop feeding it, it starves. And in that emptiness, something stronger begins to emerge. And that something doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need the weather to be perfect, or the mood to be right, or the stars to align. It just needs you to move, to begin, to take the first step, even if your legs shake while doing it. That's the threshold where excuses die. Not in some dramatic moment, but in the ordinary decision to act while uninspired, to show up while tired, to keep going when no one's watching. That's where the weak self loses its grip, because it can't survive in motion. It only exists in hesitation. Carl Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." That's a heavy truth, because it means the version of you you've been promising to become only exists in your imagination until your actions prove it. It means your intentions aren't enough, your desires aren't enough, even your pain isn't enough. Action is the only evidence of transformation, and if your life isn't changing, it's not because you're cursed, it's because you're still bargaining with your excuses. But here's what they don't want you to realize. The moment you act, the illusion ends. That fear of failure, that weight of procrastination, that fog of overthinking, it starts to dissolve the second you take that step. Because action creates clarity, it cuts through the noise. It reminds you that you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, you are not your past. You are what you choose to do, even when every part of you wants to stay the same. And it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be real. One step, one rep, one honest choice made without delay. And once you do that, you're no longer living under the rule of your weaker self. You're rebelling, quietly, powerfully, consistently. And over time, that rebellion becomes your identity, not the person who talks about change, but the person who embodies it. There's a kind of freedom that comes when excuses no longer work on you, when you hear the voice that says later and you answer with action, when you feel resistance and move anyway. That's the beginning of a new self, one that doesn't need a new year or a clean slate, just the willingness to stop waiting. Because if you can move while uninspired, if you can act without motivation, if you can show up even when the voice in your head says don't bother, you become unstoppable. So don't waste this year explaining what's holding you back. Use it to become someone who no longer accepts the story that delay is necessary, someone who sees excuses for what they are, not flaws in your discipline, but cracks in your commitment. And commitment is a choice you get to make every single day without asking anyone's permission. The death of excuses isn't loud. It won't feel like a breakthrough. It will feel like discipline, like quiet movement, like doing what you said you would. And that's what this year demands. Not more promises, not more dreams, just more action. Right now, as you are, while it's hard, while it's quiet, while it doesn't feel magical, because the magic isn't coming, but you can, and that's all you need. We grow up believing that time will take care of everything, that the hurt will fade, that the shame will dissolve, that the old habits will fall away simply because days pass. But time is not a healer, it's a mirror. It doesn't care what you've been through or what you're waiting for. It just reflects whatever you choose to do with it. And if you're hoping that time alone will somehow deliver a new version of you, you're already losing to the clock. Because while you wait, someone else is working. While you delay, someone else is building. While you pray for change, someone else is becoming it. And that difference is everything. We love the comfort of deferring responsibility to time. It's a convenient scapegoat. I'm not ready yet. It's not the right season. Maybe next year. But none of those statements change the reality that time doesn't heal pain. It exposes it. The same wound you ignore today will still bleed tomorrow. The same fear you run from now will still whisper in your ear next month. Time doesn't erase. It repeats. And if you're not conscious of that, you start mistaking patterns for progress. You convince yourself you've changed just because time has passed, when in reality, you've just become more of what you already were. That's the trap. Time rewards the disciplined and punishes the passive. The lazy become lazier, the distracted become more scattered, and the ones who take ownership, they become sharper, stronger, more resilient with each passing moment. The difference isn't in the hours, they're the same for everyone. It's in how those hours are used. Do you spend them numbing yourself from your own reflection? Or do you use them to build a version of you that your past self would be proud of? Carl Jung said, "What you most need will be found where you least want to look." And where most people refuse to look is their own history, their own timeline. Because when you look honestly, you realize time didn't change anything. You just adapted around the same avoidance. You changed scenery, not self. You learned how to disguise the pain instead of confronting it. But time doesn't forget. It brings it back in cycles. In relationships, in routines, in late nights when you're alone and can't lie to yourself anymore. If you don't interrupt the cycle, it becomes who you are. And the scariest part is that it happens quietly. Not with dramatic failure, but with small concessions. The morning skipped, the promise broken, the plan delayed. And every time you let those moments pass unchecked, you teach time to work against you. You train it to deepen the grooves of who you've always been, instead of carving out who you could be. And eventually, you look back and realize, you didn't live 10 years, you lived 1 year, 10 times. That's why change isn't measured in time, it's measured in awareness. The moment you wake up and realize time is not your ally unless you make it one, that's when everything begins to shift. Because once you see time as a mirror, you stop expecting it to fix you. You stop waiting for a future version of yourself to show up and save the current one. You start building that version brick by brick, decision by decision, day by day. Not perfectly, not all at once, but intentionally. Seneca once wrote, "While we are postponing, life speeds by." That's not just a warning, it's a reality. Time does not slow down for your healing. It does not wait for your motivation. It does not pause for your doubt. It moves, and it carries you with it, whether you're growing or not. So the question is never, how much time will it take? The real question is, what will time reveal about me if I keep living like this? And here's the truth that cuts deep. If you're not actively evolving, you're decaying. There is no neutral state. You are either sharpening your mind or letting it dull, strengthening your habits or weakening your spirit. becoming more aligned or more fractured. There is no version of you that stays the same. And that's what makes time so brutally honest. It shows you the truth, even when you refuse to see it. The person you're becoming is hidden in your patterns, not your plans. You can say you want to grow. You can talk about your goals. But if time is filled with the same actions, the same avoidance, the same excuses, then it's not transformation. It's repetition disguised as hope. And the more time you spend lying to yourself, the harder it becomes to look in that mirror and recognize who you've become. But here's the beautiful part. Mirrors can reflect change too. They don't just show you who you are. They show you who you could be if you face what's been holding you back. And that begins with no longer blaming time for your wounds. It begins by realizing that healing isn't passive. It's not something that happens while you sleep. It's something you do. Through action, through honesty, through the choice to live with intention when it's easier not to. That's the quiet war most people lose. Not because they're weak, but because they waited. They waited for pain to disappear instead of using it as a compass. They waited for clarity instead of creating it through effort. They waited for change, not realizing that time doesn't bring change. You do. Every day, every morning, every moment you decide to show up differently, even if no one sees it but you. And that decision? That's the beginning of real healing. Not the kind that hides scars, but the kind that builds something stronger in their place. Not the kind that forgets the past, but the kind that refuses to be owned by it. Not the kind that waits for a new year, but the kind that reclaims every second of this one. Time isn't against you, but it is watching you. It's holding up a mirror every single day asking, is this who you want to become? And if the answer is no, then the responsibility is yours. Not to rush, not to panic, but to act. To stop letting your life be a countdown and start treating it like a canvas. Because you're not running out of time. You're running out of excuses. And when you finally stop waiting for the future to rescue you and you start becoming the person who uses time wisely, not perfectly, but consciously, that's when everything begins to change. Not in years, not in months, but in you. The reason most people stay stuck isn't because they're not capable. It's because they want transformation without sacrifice. They want to grow, but keep every comfort, want to rise but hold on to every distraction. But power, real power, has a price. It asks you to bleed out the pieces of yourself that keep you small, the need for constant pleasure, the habit of escaping discomfort, the addiction to being liked. These aren't luxuries, they're chains. And you can't carry chains and climb at the same time. The path to your highest self is guarded by the parts of you that refuse to die quietly. And every step forward will demand you leave something behind. Sacrifice isn't some poetic idea we romanticize in hindsight. It's brutal in real time. It looks like walking away from people who once felt like home. It looks like turning down the easy way out when your body screams for rest. It looks like saying no, not just to others, but to the soft voice inside you that says, take it easy today. And that's where most fall, because they think the voice of resistance is there to protect them, when really it's the ghost of who they used to be begging for survival. Sacrifice then becomes a form of mercy, not towards that weaker self, but toward the person you could become if you stop feeding what's been holding you back. But even then, most people hesitate. They want to upgrade their lives without uninstalling their vices. They want mental strength but keep the apps that drain their willpower. They want to lead but still need applause to move forward. That's not transformation, that's negotiation. And growth doesn't make deals. It demands everything. It demands the moment you choose progress over pity, clarity over comfort, purpose over pleasure. And those choices, They're not always loud, they're not always dramatic, but they are always defining. Discipline, then, becomes your quiet sword. You use it to cut away what you once called normal. You build new patterns, not because they're easy, but because they align with the life you're no longer willing to live without. And it's lonely, this process, because sacrifice often looks like loss. You'll lose friends who don't understand. You'll lose approval from people you once tried so hard to impress. You'll even lose old parts of yourself that once gave you identity. But in return, you gain something far more dangerous: self-respect. And once you have that, the world loses its power to control you. This is why so few people truly change, because sacrifice asks you to trust the unseen, to give up what feels good now for a version of you that doesn't even exist yet. That's terrifying, but it's also the most honest kind of faith. Not in something outside you, but in the buried potential waiting for your permission to rise. That version of you is watching. It watches every choice you make. It watches what you tolerate, what you walk away from, what you fight for. And it grows stronger or weaker based on those signals. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. And we waste it most by feeding what should have been starved, that craving for ease, that fear of missing out, that endless pursuit of more. All of them feel like life, but none of them build you. They blur you, until you forget why you even started, until you convince yourself that comfort is peace. But peace isn't found in what soothes you. It's found in what stabilizes you. And nothing stabilizes like living by a code you refuse to break, even when no one's watching." And that's the final truth. Sacrifice is not loss, it's alignment. You're not giving things up. You're letting go of what never belonged to the person you're becoming, the distractions, the addictions, the lies you told yourself to survive a version of life you no longer respect. Letting them go doesn't weaken you, it clears the path. And with every sacrifice, you step more fully into who you're meant to be. Not perfect, but precise. Not safe, but free. Because freedom costs everything that once controlled you, and most people don't want that price. But you're not most people. You're the gatekeeper now, and the only thing standing between where you are and where you could be is what you're still afraid to give up. There comes a moment when reacting just isn't enough. You've been playing defense, dodging every hit, responding to every doubt, shrinking a little each time life threw something unexpected. You adjusted, you adapted, and maybe you even survived. But survival isn't the goal anymore. You've outgrown that. Because deep down, you know you weren't built just to endure the storm. You were made to become it. There's a difference between being shaped by chaos and being the one who shapes it. One makes you a victim of momentum, the other turns you into the momentum itself. You've spent long enough being moved by mood, circumstance, and the opinions of others. You wake up tired, and your energy follows. You get one piece of bad news, and the whole day collapses. That's not life, it's emotional slavery. Being ruled by the weather of your mind, by the gusts of insecurity and self-doubt. But what if the storm isn't outside of you? What if it's been waiting inside all along, untapped, misunderstood, restrained by your need to be polite to the world that's been punching you in the gut? There's a certain violence in growth, a silent, focused aggression, not toward others, but toward weakness, toward excuses, toward that old voice that whispers, "You're not ready yet." You don't silence that voice by arguing with it. You silence it by becoming something it can't reach. You build a presence so firm, so grounded, that the wind of doubt blows right past you. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And he was right. Because when you finally stop apologizing for your strength, when you stop making yourself small just to be accepted, it terrifies people. But more importantly, it transforms you. You stop negotiating with your limitations. You stop pleading for clarity. You start commanding action. Because a storm doesn't wait for permission. It moves. It disrupts. It reshapes the land. And that's who you need to become. The one who reshapes everything by how you show up. Not with noise, not with flash, but with a presence that makes people pause. The kind of silence that feels like thunder about to break. You've seen that version of yourself in flashes. Those moments when you chose discipline over distraction. When you faced the discomfort and didn't flinch. That was the storm. Not something outside coming for you, but something within. Finally being given space to breathe. And once it breathes, it expands. It spreads into your habits, your posture, your tone, your decisions. People will notice. They always do. When someone becomes the storm, the room changes before they even speak. But they won't be able to explain what shifted. They'll just say you seem different, more focused, more grounded, less reactive. And that's because you stopped being at the mercy of everything and started becoming the force that dictates it. The weather no longer moves you. You move it. And while the world spins in anxiety, chasing validation, craving distraction, you remain calm. Not because it's easy, but because you've practiced chaos until it feels like home. Epictetus once wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." This isn't about power over others. It's about power over the impulses that once ruled you. The craving to explain yourself, the urge to react, the need to feel motivated before you move. You leave all of that behind, and in its place, you build stillness. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of pressure, the kind that crushes the old you until only what matters remains. The stillness that makes action feel inevitable, not optional. That's what the storm feels like when it lives in you. It's not rage, it's clarity. It's not chaos, it's control. And now, when fear shows up, you don't run. You stand. You watch it shake and shift and howl, and then you walk through it, not as someone hoping it'll pass, but as the one causing it to break apart. Storms don't worry about being liked. They don't ask the sky for instructions. They move, they become necessary, and so do you. Necessary for your own future, necessary for every version of you that almost gave up. Because each time you chose the hard path, each time you silenced the noise and leaned into the pressure, you were preparing. You were building the kind of core that doesn't crack when life gets heavy. And every difficulty you face now becomes a tool, a blade, a map. Not because it makes you suffer, but because it forces you to grow sharper. You begin to thank the resistance, not because it's pleasant, but because it reveals where your power begins. You no longer need to wait for things to feel right. You make them right. You don't hope the weather calms. You are the weather. And that truth, once internalized, changes everything. You're not here to be gentle with your weakness. You're here to bury it, not with shame, but with clarity, not with guilt, but with movement. Every time you hold the line, every time you show up when you don't feel like it, every time you decide that now matters more than what you feel, you reinforce the storm. And one day, people will look at you and wonder how you did it. They'll wonder how you got so calm, so composed, so clear. But they won't understand what it cost. And that's okay, because you weren't doing it for applause. You were doing it because you refused to die as someone who was always almost ready. Plato once said, "The first and best victory is to conquer self." And you do that every single day when you move with command instead of waiting for signs. You don't chase the storm anymore. You don't fear it. You carry it in your chest, in your breath, in your silence. And when life presses against you, you don't flinch. You rise. You don't react, you lead, because you are no longer waiting to become something greater. You were never meant to tiptoe through life. You were meant to move like thunder. If this spoke to something buried deep inside you, don't stop here. Watch the next video on your screen and keep rising into who you're becoming. And thank you, truly, for being a part of Stoic Journal.